Let's start in earnest. We'll start 1 minute early. Today is what I call a baloney day. If you've been to my classes, I've shared with you on a few occasions one of my favorite phrases that an old business professor at Cedarville used to say. If there was ever a class where he had a lot of information to share, he would say that today's going to be like fitting 10 pounds of bologna in a 5-pound bag. And so I just love that. That'll stick with me forever. And so I do have 10 pounds of bologna, and my bag is limited. So we will start early and we will start rapidly. I'll talk fast. If you need some clarification on dates or information, feel free to stop me. But first and foremost, did anybody happen to read the reading from last week, Lectures to Theological Students, a lecture to theological students? Anybody read it? 1, 2? Half.
Yeah.
Half. You read half.
I read some of it.
Read some of it. Okay.
Not even half.
Any immediate thoughts on that lecture?
It's a worthwhile read.
It's a,
I intend to finish.
okay. It's a worthwhile read. Okay, so that's a good thought. That even if you didn't finish it, it's still valuable and it's worthy to finish. Any other thoughts?
So your other question last week was, should pastors be educated?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes.
And Warfield was a strong yes.
Yes, for sure, for sure. So hopefully you saw the connection. For those who didn't read it, my question to you all last week is, if you so desired, you can write a little prompt on, is it necessary for ministers to be trained? Is it necessary for ministers to be trained? And if you read that, the answer is, in B.B. Warfield's opinion, in my opinion, it's an affirmative, that yes, that if you are going into the work of ministry, you should be trained. It's just like any other profession. And in that lecture, he leans hard on the theology of vocation, that just as if any vocation in your life, most of you are not going to be in the ministerial position, but no matter what your vocation is, it is highly crucial for you to view your job as a work unto the Lord. This is a very much a early reformer. Luther was big into this. Calvin was big into this, that every Christian has a vocation. Even if it's sweeping the floor, you should do it as a divine duty, that you might not see it as this high calling, but the Lord has given it to you, and He encourages you. He's calling you to treat it with some earnestness, with devotion, with worship. And so the theological student should go with that same mindset. And he talks on several points that it's the temptation of the theological student, and I think it's the temptation of a lot of Christians, is that when they step into the world of learning, when they pick up their books, there's almost thought that is when I turn to my books, I'm turning from God. That when I'm doing something that isn't in the explicit realm of going to church, reading my Bible, praying, fasting, that when I do anything over in this side of the world, that they're disconnected. So when I go and I work as an accountant or a carpenter or an engineer or whatever my job may be, there's a temptation within our hearts to say this is the secular realm, right? And that's an effect of the Enlightenment, that this world belongs to the devil, essentially. We might not necessarily think and speak in those terms, but our mind kind of goes to that way, that it's separated. But for Warfield, his encouragement is no, treat this work, and I would encourage you, treat your work, whatever that work is, as if this is a duty unto the Lord. That when I do this, it is an act of worship. I'm serving the Lord. God has given me this. And I can use this to influence the world, call people to Christ, bring about the dominion mandate where I'm bringing this world under the dominion of Christ. Even if it is as simple as in the world of carpentry, you can bring the world under the dominion of Christ in everywhere that you go. So his big focus, and the big focus of all of Princeton, is going to be this sentiment, piety and learning. That a big focus for all of Princeton is going to be piety and learning. That we learned from last week, John Witherspoon, he was a president of Princeton College, or College of New Jersey, and his whole emphasis was piety and learning. That you should be very interested in literature and education and academics, and at the same time you should be in piety. And one without the other is absolutely not profitable, improfitable to you. Is that a word, improfitable? Unprofitable. So the emphasis for Warfield in that portion, And then finally, he really dives deep. It's fascinating. You should read it. I encourage you to read it. He really dives deep into the effect on a student, theological student, to build up his piety through especially communal worship. That it is not possible for a minister to be successful in his training and in his work if he is not diving into the community, growing with people, being held accountable, being challenged into sin. So really great read. I want you to take away piety and learning. I would give you this sentiment. I think it is absolutely crucial for ministers to be trained. If I had to guess, most pastors today in the SBC world, greater, big denominations, big evangelical world, most pastors have no formal training when it comes to theology and pastoral ministry. A lot of it is just you feel called. I mean, I was a pastor in the SBC. I had no training other than a Bible minor at Cedarville, plenty of other guys I knew. You were able to just plant a church with no training. Now, I want to caveat this. Do I think that you have to have an MD, or not an MD, medical, you don't have to have a medical degree for sure, but you don't have to have a PhD or an MDiv in order to be a minister, in order to be a pastor. You look at A.W. Tozer. This man, if you're not familiar with him, early 20th century, amazing pastoral man, great writer, was self-read, self-taught, did all that by himself. But he was self-taught. Taught is the emphasis, and he learned from history, and he learned from great men. He learned from Augustine. He learned from these parts, and he avoided a lot of heresy. And I would encourage you that if you're saying no, you should look throughout history and find that most people who start heresies are untrained people. The Mormons started by untrained people. The Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, started by untrained people. They just thought by the Spirit of God they could be led into this way. Even the disciples, we would say the disciples weren't trained. You'd have to look. 3 years with Christ. That's a training. You followed a rabbi. You did everything he did. You ate with him. You learned with him. That is the work of being trained in your ministry. So I'd encourage you to think about that in your own individual life as you pursue Christ in your work and in your faith. All right, the past 2 weeks, I should say, we started with two men and the comparison between two men. The first week we talked about Charles Finney, Charles Hodge. Last week we talked about Immanuel Kant and Thomas Reed. This week we're going to start with David Brainerd and Woodrow Wilson. Does anybody know who these people are? Just a slight affirmation. Who are some of these gentlemen?
David Brainerd was an early missionary to the American Indians.
Very good. Very good.
Friend of Edwards.
Good friend of Jonathan Edwards. Right. So David Brainerd, missionary to the Indians, friend of Jonathan Edwards. And who's the fellow on that right? Who's the handsome guy over there?
Former president.
Former president. Come on, Americans. You don't know all of your presidents in alphabetical order and in numerical order? No. So Woodrow Wilson, president of the United States during the First World War, and president of Princeton University. Again, David Brainerd was converted during the Great Awakening in the 18th century, 1700s. Had this incredible conversion experience, was attending the University of Yale, and is expelled from Yale because of his criticism against the administration. The administration was kind of pushing back against men like George Whitefield, if you know who that is, preacher from England. Yale was kind of trying to push away the influences of the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening. David Brainerd speaks up about this. He gets expelled. He then becomes a missionary to the New England area Native Americans. Basically is living in a tent, giving his whole life to it. He gets sick. He gets nursed by Esther Edwards. We talked about Esther Edwards last week, daughter of Jonathan Edwards, would marry Aaron Burr Sr., and he dies, I believe, about the age of 29 years old. He leaves behind the Diary and Journal of David Brainerd, which is an incredible read. It's just very devotional, very just a challenge on what does it look like to follow Christ. And so he's seen as, in his time and in today, as this man of great sacrifice, to go on missions and to expend his whole self for the sake of Christ. Aaron Burr, Aaron Burr Sr. had this to say about David Brainerd. If it had not been for the treatment received by Mr. Brainerd at Yale, New Jersey College would have never been erected. So it's because David Brainerd gets expelled from Yale, that Presbyterians then look and say, well, then we need an institution to be able to train up our ministers. So he is the reason, in a way, in a small way, for the beginning of Princeton College, the College of New Jersey, as we talked about last week, and then eventually Princeton Seminary. And Woodrow Wilson is his reason for its downfall. It is these two men that are pitted against each other. Woodrow Wilson, as I said, was President of the United States during World War I. He was the architect of the League of Nations. The League of Nations is essentially a forerunner to the United Nations, what we know today, a coalition of nations trying to work together for world peace, yada, yada, yada. League of Nations is a term that Woodrow Wilson takes from Kant. Kant is a huge influence on Woodrow Wilson. Once again, there's a through line. Hopefully you're seeing some through lines throughout this classroom. And so he is a Presbyterian man. He goes to the Presbyterian Church in Princeton, the city of Princeton, while he's the president there. But he expands the liberalization of Princeton University. And he drives a big wedge between the seminary and the university because he begins to allow it to be opened up to Catholic and Jewish professors. When the majority in the past were Presbyterian men, he kind of pushed away kind of the rigidity of Orthodox Presbyterianism, Orthodox Christianity within the university. Now, he helps it grow like crazy. He brings tons of students, tons of money, tons of faculty members from all around the world to Princeton University. He builds it up to be an academic institution that is worth talking about, but at the sacrifice of it being Presbyterian and at the sacrifice of it being Orthodox. So by the time he leaves, only 1/3 of the students are Presbyterian, come from a Presbyterian background. When he started, it was 2/3. All right, so that is kind of the bookends. But we'll see that there's actually a true enemy to the downfall of Old Princeton as we are studying it. But before we get to that, let's talk about the Log College. Now, before you could go to a seminary in America, before there were institutions where you could go to a big old campus and you could study, if a young man felt the calling of being a minister, he would go to his local pastor, he'd go to his local reverend, especially if he was Presbyterian, and he would say, I feel the call and I want to be trained. And so he would then live with that man and his wife, and he would eat at their dinner table, and he would sleep in the spare room, and he would be trained in theology, and he'd be trained in pastoral ministry. And he did this for a handful of years before he had the ability to go before the presbytery. Hopefully, if you were here last week, you understood that the presbytery is a group of ministers. It's a group of churches in your local area. And then they are responsible for ordaining and licensing additional ministers. So before you could do that and pass the test to be licensed or ordained, you would be going to someone's house and you'd be trained in that way. Well, to build on top of that, there was a very famous institution called the Log College. This was started by a man named William Tennant, who was kind of in the sphere of Jonathan Edwards. He influenced the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening in a lot of ways. And so he had a school that ran in, it's not Poughkeepsie. What's the name of the city? Neshaminy. You know where Neshaminy is? No, I don't either. But it started in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, and it existed for over 20 years, and it was a huge institution of churning out men before any seminaries existed. And so it existed to train them in the Reformed doctrines, in Presbyterian, Westminster Confession. And so it was a big influence. It became a huge influence on Archibald Alexander. Him and William Tennant, he would kind of disciple Archibald Alexander at an early age, and so it has a huge influence. At a final speech, one of the final speeches given at Princeton Seminary, a professor once said that at the back of Princeton Seminary is Princeton College, and at the back of Princeton College is the Log College. So essentially what he's saying is that Princeton Seminary is here because of Princeton University being started and the influence it had, and Princeton University starts because of the Log College. And so ultimately that gets closed down. They want to figure out how to train men. As I said, in 1746, Princeton Seminary, or Princeton College is started, College of New Jersey. By 1812, the majority of students, even before that, around 1810, the majority of students at the College of New Jersey were no longer studying the ministry. They were going into law, they were going in big into politics. As I spoke beforehand, Princeton University has a huge impact on the Revolutionary War, on the building of America. Well, a man named Ashbel Green, this handsome fellow right here, you can still get, if you go to a barbershop, you could ask for the Ashbel and he'll give you that haircut. And so Ashbel Green is the president of the College of New Jersey, and he has this burning desire to train up ministers, to train up men in the work of Presbyterian pastoral work. So he goes to the General Assembly, the collection of all the Presbyterian presbyteries in America, and he says that we need to start an institution. We need to start a seminary. And so he creates the plan for a seminary. So basically this is essentially an outline of why we need to start this institution, what it should look like, and what it should be. So he works upon that. Essentially the General Assembly will be a patron of the seminary. It will run the seminary. So major decisions will be run through the General Assembly. This is really key for later on. In 1810, they approve the plan. In 1811, they give $14,000 to the plan. In 1812, they vote for the school to go to Princeton, the town of Princeton. So again, for those who might be confused about the distinction, Princeton University, what we know as today, the Tigers, has nothing to do with the seminary. I mean, they have a history together. They have a close connection, but it's different administrations, different programming, different finances, different everything, right? And so these are two different institutions, and this was explicitly started for the purpose of training ministers. Some of the big ideas of the plan: in order to be a minister, you had to pass an oral examination, and so at Princeton, you were going to become a sound biblical critic. You were going to get skills in original languages, knowledge of the Bible content, history, and geography, defender of the Christian faith against deism, support doctrines of the confession of faith and catechisms. You're going to become sound in theology and church history, well-read on practical writings, skilled in sermon presentation, and study the form of the government of the Presbyterian Church. So that's what they wanted you to get as you were going into this university. So what we want to do is we want to look at the history of, actually, you know what, let's just do this because it's in my notes. Let's look at what would you experience at Princeton Seminary, and then we'll go into kind of the broad history. So first and foremost, your academics. Your first year was devoted to the Bible. You would have got an analytic study of the English Bible. You would have started your Hebrew and your Greek. You would have got into biblical criticism, which we talked last week. Biblical criticism comes from kind of German theology, where we're looking at the Bible with a skeptical eye. We're doubting what it is, what it says, but they're going to use it for the benefit of, no, we can be critical with the Bible, but for the affirmation of it. And then you're going to learn Bible history. They called it sacred chronology, so you learned the timeline. They called it sacred geography. You learned kind of, here's Israel, here's Assyria, here's Babylon, so on and so forth. Jewish antiquities and Oriental customs. Your second year, you got more original languages. You started your systematic theology, biblical and church history. And then third year, your final year, you did systematic theology, church history, church government, pastoral care, and homiletics, which is the preaching of the word. And so in 3 years, you would be able to study at your seminary and then go off and be ordained if you pass your oral test. The spiritual life, I talked about this. So that's the learning portion of the university. That's what they were learning while they're there. The piety portion. Every day started with morning prayers. Morning prayers were led by the students. They also had evening prayers that were led by the professors at the university. A big influence on the school was the Sunday afternoon conference. So essentially, the university would hold a church service in the morning, which would be very much what we'd experience here on Sunday. But then they have a Sunday afternoon conference where a student, a professor, an outside speaker would come in and talk about anything about biblical criticism or church history or a particular part of theology, and it was a huge influence on it. A.A. Hodge, who is one of the systematic professors at the university, he said, in many respects, the most remarkable and memorable exercise in the entire seminary course. So it had a huge influence on him. B.B. Warfield said, it kept the fire burning on the altar for 100 years. Another man who was a student of the university, William Irving, said about Charles Hodge, he says, "No triumph of his tongue or his pen ever so thrilled or moved the human hearts as did the utterance at the Sabbath afternoon conference in the seminary or oratory, or basically their chapel area." So there's this huge influence. The whole goal is that we want you to be people of piety and learning. The Sunday conference kind of helps, as Warfield says, kind of stoke that fire, keep the fire on the altar for over 100 years. Princeton Seminary is then going to become one of the biggest influence on missions in the United States in the 18th and 19th century. They send out dozens and dozens and dozens of missionaries from the seminary as they graduate. And I truly believe that this is something that not just, modern America is missing, but probably in our more reformed world. I think we're missing a heart and ambition for missions. They had this yearning, this desire to bring about the revival of souls throughout the world. And so immediately they would send out missionaries to India, to Africa, to Hawaii. A son of Archibald Alexander, J.W. Alexander, would go to India and he would preach the gospel to people there. And so they had two groups that were a part of that. The Society of the Brethren and the Society of Inquiry on the Subject of Missions. Both of these groups were for the explicit purpose of converting people in their class to become missionaries. The Society of the Brethren was essentially a semi-secret group. It wasn't being posted about, it wasn't being talked about. And in order to become a member of the Brethren, you had to make a commitment to give your life to missions once you left the seminary. And so they're training up and infusing this fire, this desire to bring about missions. The Society of Inquiry on the Subject of Missions, which they just called the Society of Inquiry. It started at Andover Seminary, which was another Presbyterian seminary that started eventually. They would meet on the first Monday of every month, and they would talk missions. A professor would come in, a missionary would come in, and essentially are trying to proselytize people to become proselytizers. Their hope was to spur people on. This group of people had one of the fascinating things, they had a museum of idols. So they would write letters to different missionaries across the world, and they would ask, if you ever find an idol, a little carved gold wooden thing from the people that you're converting, send it here. And one of the young men said that seeing that museum of idols would stir up the heart of a believer far more than any amount of prayer could do, right? Because it would inspire you to say, there are people that are still bowing down to wood and gold, and we have to go out and we have to preach the gospel. So big emphasis on training people. So once again, learning and piety mixed together. We're going to walk through the timeline of the university, and we're going to do it in 5 movements. This is going to be a lot of information. Hopefully I can share it well, but as we move along, some things I'll kind of skim by, but these 4 men we will talk more in depth with. We'll miss this guy over here. We'll move it through 5 movements. Essentially, we're going to look at the 5 professors of systematic theology throughout the existence of Old Princeton. The systematic theology professor was known as the most influential member of the faculty. That was the person who usually had the strongest pen. It was usually the person who had the loudest voice and was influencing the culture, not just in the seminary, but broader throughout Christianity and in liberal theology overall. So Archibald Alexander, we'll get to him in a second, but he starts in 1812. Charles Hodge takes over for him in 1840. In 1887, A.A. Hodge, Charles's son, takes over. He dies in 1887. Then you have B.B. Warfield, which might be one of the most famous names from Old Princeton. He's in charge until 1921. And then Caspar Wister Hodge, which I think Caspar is a name you don't really get enough of today. But Caspar Wister Hodge Jr. takes over, and at the break of 1929, but he continues to go on until 1937. Okay, he still stays at Princeton until that long. So we'll look at the 5 big systematic theology professors and some of the things that they went along. First and foremost, we'll talk about this man next week in a greater way. But Archibald Alexander is the first professor at the university. He is a traveling itinerant minister. He then becomes the president of a small seminary called Sydney College. He becomes the president of a college. He then is called to be the first professor of Princeton University. It starts in his living room, essentially, when he is a professor. There's not a building yet. There's not a building until 1815. And so he is teaching men in his classroom. It starts with 4 students the first semester. By the second semester, it gets to about 12 students. And he is just doing this a lot of times without pay. He is a huge part of the founding of the school. We will talk a lot more about him, a lot more interesting details. He's an incredible guy. It's one of those guys that when you read about him, he seems like he was as good as he sounds, right? Like you get the sense that like, man, he was great in his personal life, in his academic life. He just sounds like an incredible man. Like I said, we'll dive deeper into him. A huge part of the tenure at Alexander of Alexander as president is a division between the Old and New School Presbyterians, or Old and New School Reformed. So this was a schism within the General Assembly that pitted people who were Old School and New School. Now, let me just explain what the New School is, and then by that you'll be able to compare with the Old School. The New School was based upon a group of theologians that were the second generation after Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards has incredible mind. He was very philosophical, and he wanted to address sin, the nature of sin. How are you and I guilty of sin? Now, what is the theological answer of why we are sinful? We're inclined to do so. What's the theological term we like to use about the inclination of sin? Total depravity, original sin. Total depravity, essentially. So, original sin is the doctrine that all of us have a corrupt nature by extension of Adam. That at Adam, we fall in Adam. Now, this kind of gets convoluted. The question is, are you guilty of Adam's sin before or after you're given the sinful nature? Now, I'm not going to have time to discuss that. The most Reformed answer is that we are given Adam's sin. The Reformed answer is that you are guilty, each one of you are guilty of eating the apple, we don't know if it was an apple, of eating the fruit as much as Adam is. You will die and you will stand before Christ, and if you do not have Christ as your Savior, your first sin on your list will be eating the fruit. Okay? And then based upon that, you are given total depravity. You are given a sinful, corrupt nature. I am corrupt in every part of my being, is the catechism that my children learn. Jonathan Edwards is going to say, no. You are given the corrupt nature, and then you become guilty. Now, this is a bit of a nuance. This is such a sleight of hand, and it's not that big of a deal. But what is going to happen is the New School theologians are going to emphasize in greater way that our sin is separate from Adam, that these are two distinct things. So you're going to have a group that it's going to be called the New Divinity. They're going to essentially say that human beings are pretty good. They're corrupt, but they can choose the right way. Then you're going to have a man from Yale who's going to invent the New Haven theology that's going to say that human beings are good at their nature and that they can choose God. There is not a sin from Adam. Okay, we are not totally depraved. So if you remember my first week, I talked about how there's a spectrum between progressivism or liberalism and conservatism, right? And if the Bible is here on the level of conservatism, this is the Bible, and if just to the left, just for the sake of argument, the Westminster Confession of Faith sits here, right? Jonathan Edwards is probably going to be pretty much overlapping, J.E., right? The new divinity is going to be a little bit to the left, still fairly conservative, and the New England or the New Haven people are going to be they're going to be crossing a boundary out of orthodoxy and into progressivism. Okay? So the discussion during Alexander's time is, what do we do with the New School people, right? This became a huge debate. Essentially, it culminates, after years and years of discussion in the General Assembly, is that the Old School and the New School people are going to split. That the Old School are going to keep what is known as today as the PCUSA, and the New School people are going to start their own denomination. They do this, and the big part of this is that the New School sues the Old School for portions of their funds, right? Because all of these presbyteries have been putting monies in the general fund, and so the New School then sues them and says, we want some of that money because we paid for it. Well, they win this court case. And what is wild, as you read the book that I shared with you about what I read for this class, the world was so different back in that day. They would cover theological debates. There would be like an article from one theologian to another, and like the New York Times is writing a piece about it. Like that would never happen today. And this trial is like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. Like it is, people are covering it, everybody is watching it. I mean, it is fascinating to these people. And that's just the different world that we live in. Like there's huge schisms within the SBC, and sure, you and I probably know them, and then maybe there's like a 2-minute headline somewhere on ABC News television, but they're not sending their best reporters, right? They're not focusing on this. This is huge news to these people, right? It's a boring world back then, and I kind of appreciate it. It's a more innocent time. I wish I could live in it, to be honest. But the Old School and the New School are going to divide over this schism, and it's going to lead to some real distress. It's going to lead to the biggest distress because there was a fear that if the Old School was the one to split from the assembly, which there were rumblings, then Princeton, who is run by the General Assembly, would be under the New School. They'd be under those influences, right? And Charles Hodge and Archibald Alexander are like, that cannot happen. But then once they sue and they get money, there's a moment where they think that they're going to go under. They think that the school was done. They don't have the finances for it. And what's fascinating is that for many, many years, throughout the history of Old Princeton, they run at a deficit. During this period, there's a handful of years where faculty are not getting paid to do their job. They're doing this out of just the pure kindness and love of the Lord within their hearts. So there's a huge schism. There's tons of heresy trials. So if you are convinced, if you're spouting out heresy I'm the pastor of First Presbytery of Columbus, and I'm spouting out heresy. My presbytery has the ability to look at the General Assembly and say, he's a heretic, he needs to go to trial. And they're basically going to ask me questions about my theology, and I can make a statement saying, hey, I do believe in it, even though I really don't, but I can be freed from it. A lot of people are convicted, are kicked out of their presbyteries, are defrocked, if you will. And so this is a absolute huge schism. They make it through. Eventually, just after the Civil War, the Old School and the New School group will be back together. And here's what's really fascinating. I don't want to miss this part. So if I'm saying here's my spectrum of liberal and conservatism, the Bible is right there. The Westminster Confession is right there. Jonathan Edwards is overlapping a little bit with the Westminster Confession. He's just a little wonky. His predecessors, the New Divinity and the New Divinity and versus New Haven, they're going left. Okay, Princeton is going to do its best to stand on the Westminster Confession of Faith. Right? They're going to be as much as possible. In this, the Old School are over here. They begin to want to make requirements to say that in order to be a part of our presbytery, you have to make certain allegiances to orthodoxy that Princeton is saying, no. You're asking too much right there. It's too conservative in the fact that it's asking things that are above what the Bible asks. And so what's interesting is that Princeton in this time is sitting in the middle. And it's getting shots from the Old School and the New School. It's kind of getting both ends of the spectrum. And so, but they do an amazing job of saying, listen, most people in the new school are not heretics. They're not terrible people. Some of them are, and they should be removed from the presbytery. But for the most part, these are solid people. Let's not burn bridges. Let's not destroy people's reputations, so on and so forth. So that is a huge debate that's going on within. And what you will realize throughout the history is that the General Assembly is going to drag Princeton into a lot of controversy. That'll be a little bit of the issue here. For Charles Hodge, there's a lot that goes into Charles Hodge. He started what was called the Biblical Repertory, which eventually became the Princeton Theological Review. He leads that. Charles Hodge is constantly writing articles and letters and notes. He is just a theological, bulwark for the school. A lot goes on during his tenure, but we'll talk about mainly two things: slavery and Civil War. As you read the history of Princeton, you will realize that there is a really big soft spot in the heart of Princeton Seminary for the African American community. They are constantly starting Bible schools, Sunday schools for students within the local presbyteries of black communities. There's a woman named Betsy Stockton who she was a freed slave. She then becomes a trained missionary, and she starts Sunday schools where she's going. There's this huge passion to say that there's something wrong, there's something deeply wrong with America during this time. What happens in 1861? American students, what happens in 1861? Civil War, right? So all leading up, there's this movement among students to say things like this. Where do we have it here? Big heart for social reform. Where is it in my notes? Help me, Lord. Betsy Stockton, slavery, yada, yada, yada. They have a big heart for social reform. They speak of this. They say this about the issues of the Native American. Andrew Jackson is president. He does the Trail of Tears, if you know that American history. He says that the students were quoted in saying this: they were critical of the cruel and oppressive measures against the Indians. They warned against that national sins would be visited with national judgments. They say this they say similar things about the issues of slavery. Now, we are really kind of warped, and hopefully I don't say that too offensively, in our current culture as conservative Americans. Anytime people were to say that we need social reform, we should care about the lives of African American people, slavery is a national sin that's going to bring national judgment, we hear that today as reactionaries to the liberalism of our world and go, whoa, be careful now, right? But freed from that mindset that we live in now, they have the ability to look at slavery and say, this is a wrong thing to do. This is a terrible thing to do. Now, the way that they hope to address it is through African colonization. Their hope was to send missionaries to Africa and then produce a program that would send freed slaves over to Africa for them to say, all right, be your own autonomous people. What they do not go for, and what Charles Hodge is really good at, is staying in the middle again, is that you have the abolitionists on one side, and then you have the pro-slavery people on the other side. He's going to look at the pro-slavery people, even his Presbyterian friends, is going to say that to be pro-slavery is unbiblical. To say that we should hope to enslave generations of people is wrong. And at the same time, he's going to say to the abolitionist, to do some sort of revolutionary act, to act with violence in order to free slaves, is also a wrong action. His hope was that through the gospel, we can train up people, we can work with African American people, and that they can be liberated and ready. They recognize that if you just freed African Americans, slaves during that time, they don't know how to function in a society that you and I, or at that time, they would have existed in, right? They don't know common laws, they don't know how to start businesses, and so the goal was to train them up. So that's what they're all about. Well, a big portion of this is the Civil War. They were gonna hire a professor named Robert Louis Dabney. to be the teacher of the professor of ecclesiastical history. He turned it down. He was a Southern man, and he says this, that he felt that he would be forced, that the country would be forced into the war before he could get a fair start in Princeton, and he would have to return to his own state and his own people. Well, Dred Scott decision, which says that captured slaves in the North have to go down to the South, that causes tension. John Brown's raid, where they go to the armory, they kill people, they take the guns, and then Lincoln's election is a domino effect that leads to, in 1860, South Carolina secedes the Union, followed by 10 other states to do so, and then the war begins in June of 1861. Over 400 Princeton College students and alumni served in the war, a large number of officers on both sides. 66 of the men from the college were killed in the war on both sides. And so this is a huge, huge issue. Now, what was the role of Charles Hodge? So you have Northern Presbyterians and you have Southern Presbyterians, right? What are you going to do in order to hold this together? Well, the South was promulgating this idea that the church is a divine institution, that it does not have the right to speak to political, secular issues. So in this matter, when it comes to the war, let's not talk about it. Charles Hodge is going to say, no. We do not have the authority over the secular political world, but we do have a voice to preach the gospel. And the gospel tells us that actions like this, like slavery and rebellion against the Union, are wrong. That we should speak out and say certain things. Now, if you look, and there are certain theologians today that would take the Southerner side. There are Reformed men that, this is a quote I heard recently, that even in the time of the Holocaust, the church would have nothing to say to the Nazi regime. And to me, we can have a debate about it. It'd be an interesting conversation for the future. I think that is one of the most wild, absurd things to ever say, is that the church has no right to speak and preach the gospel to secular ideas. Now, we don't have the ability or the right to usurp the political realm, right? This goes into a whole lot of Reformed theology. But to be able to say we don't speak to it is crazy. So Charles Hodge is also, so he's saying to the pro-slavery men, listen, this is a sin. We have the right to speak to it. But then the General Assembly is going to say something like, in order to be in the presbytery, in order to be a part of our church, you have to give allegiance to the Union. You have to give your allegiance. Your church, you as a minister, have to publicly say, I support the federal Union. Charles Hodge comes along as a good fence sitter and says, now that is too extreme as well. You can't require, as church membership, saying that you support the government, that you have to support the government. And he said this would be as absurd as requiring us to sing the Star-Spangled Banner at the communion table, right? This isn't a requirement that we should be putting upon people. So I really enjoy Charles Hodge and Archibald Alexander for their ability to sit in the middle, to be a moderate. I think sometimes the moderate gets the bad rap. I think they get seen as not taking a side, kind of being too safe. But I think it takes wisdom and courage and some steadfastness to say, listen, all my hope is to stay as close to the Bible as I possibly can. And there are going to be people on my left and on my right who are going to be my interlocutors, and my hope is to pull you towards the Bible, right? Today, again, in a lot of our cultural debates, I think we will see there's extremes on both sides, and I think maybe it's just my natural inclination. I'm a very moderate person to begin with, so I appreciate the moderate. Now, we'll talk about in a second why, at some point, that the camel's back breaks, and to be a moderate is to be a fool. We'll talk about that in a minute. So A.A. Hodge is an incredible man. During the Civil War, in the middle of the Civil War, 1862, Princeton Seminary celebrates its 50th year. 2,422 men by its 50th year had studied at Princeton. 29 states were included in that, several European countries. At its 50-year anniversary, they had 127 foreign missionaries 94 college professors at other schools, 36 college presidents, 28 professors at theological seminaries. So it is producing men who are creating a change. It's producing an influence in the world. We'll transition to A.A. Hodge. Charles dies. He steps down. His son takes over. Charles dies a little bit later, the next year, 1878. So A.A. Hodge, the son of Charles Hodge, named after Archibald Alexander Hodge. Fun fact. We'll talk more about these two guys' relationship. They really loved each other. But Archibald Alexander Hodge takes over as the systematic professor. There are tons of controversies that are growing at this time. Shifting culture, evolution gains steam. I don't have too much to talk about him. We'll have a whole week about him, so we'll really get into him. But during the period after the Civil War, a man named Francis Landy Patton said this. He said, he warned against broad churchism and predicted that the day was coming when the Presbyterian Church would have to fight to save its Reformed theology. So he's saying this in 1878, right? This man has a little bit of that prophetic touch, right? He's able to see that there is a storm a-brewing in the world. During this time, the U.S. faced the practical and moral dilemmas of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. There were also indications of progressive shifts in moral attitudes and religious views. So the school is continuing to grow. There's 172 students in 1880. So the school is doing well, but there are growing shifts towards moral realities, theological realities. Again, we don't have too much time to talk about that. A quick summary would be in 1878, same year the year after he was started, there was a publication called Essays and Reviews. And it was a set of 7 essays published in England that set forth the idea that very much like the origin of human species, the origin of Christianity is one of evolution. Christianity was not an inspired movement by a divine actor, but a slow growth of cultural and societal trends that morphed into what is known as Christianity. So 7 essays are written. 6 of the men who wrote the essays are ministers within the Church of England, and they essentially come out and say that Christianity is not what you think it is. It is not a received inspirational or a received inspired truth. It is a collection of Jewish ideas and Roman ideas morphing over the centuries, growing into something. All people want a Savior. All people want a Messiah. Let's pick Jesus. His teachings are moral. They're good. Let's say he did some miracles. And that's what we believe now. And so this is a huge break from the orthodoxy of the Bible. So, as I said, things begin to shift. The poles are moving, right? If progressive and conservatism are always tugging, this idea, if the pole used to be here in the middle, the center used to be in the middle, now the center, that's not right. The center would be over here. Conservatism is shrinking. The Bible is being less and less the norm. More people are swayed towards progressivism. Things are shifting to the left at a rapid pace. What in the world is going to happen? The tension is growing. I'm getting nervous. Well, 1887, A.A. Hodge dies suddenly, and a young student named Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield takes the throne as the systematic, I should probably shouldn't say throne, but he takes the chair of the systematic theology professor. This man is an incredible mind. He was just one of the most smart intellectual men of all time, but certainly of his time. During his tenure, there was a desire to refine the confession. So the Westminster Confession of the Faith is the confession of the Presbyterian Church. And there was a desire that we need to begin to reshape this. In 1887, there was a discussion, there was a committee in Scotland that looked at the Reformed churches in Europe, and it said that most of the churches in Europe had already revised their confession, and American churches were ready to do the same. So, as we move forward, in 1889, the General Assembly votes to amend the confession. Now, they do this in very small ways. They essentially say that they're going to Where we go. They add 2 new chapters on the Holy Spirit and the love of God. They add a declaratory statement about God's eternal decrees, a statement on elect babies, and then the dropping that the Pope is the Antichrist. So of those, I think they really failed on the Pope is the Antichrist thing. Come on, somebody. No, so essentially there's a hope that what they're saying here, what the desire of the General Assembly is, we have put too much emphasis on God's decrees and not enough emphasis on the human will. The human will. And so that what they want to do is they want to put a greater emphasis that God loves people and He has given them the free ability in and of themselves to make a decision to follow Him. Last week we talked about this with Immanuel Kant, this idea of human ontological moral innocence. That human beings, at their root, this is the Enlightenment idea, at your root, you are good. That it is the societies and institutions and the cultures that you live in that shape you to make the decisions that you ought not to be making. And so swimming in the waters of this post-Enlightenment world of progressive and liberal theology, what is going to begin to happen is that the poles are going to continue to move so that conservatism is further and further away, and the desire is to emphasize that human beings are good. This theology of the New Haven people who were far left, got kicked out of the presbytery, is now coming more than a half century later, and now it will become the prominent idea. That is the theology of most people. That is going to be a growing influence upon this. To try to combat this. So they're trying to combat this. Again, conservatism, liberalism, conservatism, there's going to be a struggle, right? And it's going to get to a critical mass. When will that critical mass become? So in 1892 is something passed by the General Assembly called the Portland Deliverance. And it has to state that the Old and New Testament were the inspired Word of God delivered without error. That's an issue. If you have to make a public statement amongst your General Assembly that the Word of God is inspired, that means that it's being questioned in the first place. It is not just a carte blanche statement that you could say anymore. It has to be affirmed outwardly and visibly and physically constantly. It's not just something that people are taking advantage of anymore. And so the General Assembly in 1892 has to make this verbal statement. The Bible is inspired. That's a problem. When you have to make public statements like that, it means that idea is under attack. 40 years ago, you never had to say marriage is between a man and a woman. That man is born man and woman is born. You didn't have to have that discussion. It was just an accepted reality. The fact that churches have to make statements like that is a problem, right? It's a problem because it's saying that it's not just a given anymore. This is not just your presupposition that you grow up with and you exist in. You have to be making these statements, okay? This is when being neutral, I shouldn't say neutral, being moderate isn't helpful anymore. This is when you cannot be moderate anymore. This is when you have to make a stand and say, no. We are not going to say that the Bible is a collection of humans' writings, and maybe there is some sense of divine direction. The liberals are not going to completely delete out God from some of these conversations, but for the most part, they're going to say they are of human origin. And where you have to say, no, these are of God's origin, that is a problem. When conversations become public like that, you know that there's an issue within the culture. So I told you about the Portland Deliverance. It said that it is the inspired Word of God. This caused Union Seminary, which was a Presbyterian seminary, to terminate its relationship with the General Assembly. Them having to come out and say that this is the Word of God caused this theological university to say, we're done. We're stepping away from that. This is huge, right? They're slowly peeling away. Andover Seminary, which if I didn't mention, they were the ones who started the Society of Inquiry into missions. So they were classical, reformed, conservative theology just over 80 years ago. Now they published something called Progressive Orthodoxy. It suggested that theology could no longer be viewed as a fixed body of eternal, valid truths, but should be viewed as a fixed, but should be adjusted to the standards and needs of the cultural moment. Right? Theology is not an eternal reality. Theology is a momentary convenience. And whatever is convenient in this moment is what I will use. It's expediency. It's utilitarian. If it's not helpful to talk about sexual mores anymore, well, then let's just drop it. We could say that that is not the theology of the Bible anymore. God still speaks. Go to your local Methodist church. They'll have a sign outside most likely that says, God still speaks. But
Are you saying that the Union Seminary broke for those reasons?
yes, so Union Seminary broke away from that for that particular reason, and then Andover published a book saying that theology isn't eternally true, that it's for momentary, whatever the moment, the cultural moment speaks of. Good question. Later on, the General Assembly will draft an amendment, further amendments to the confession. Again, the biggest debate will be about God's decree. Who's in charge, God or us? It's going to be the biggest question. The Enlightenment will tell you that we are, that human beings are. And then, there's a big part coming up. Make sure I don't miss it. Okay, there we go. So it continues to be a discussion within the General Assembly. Another big part of the conversation as Warfield are changing requirements. The changing requirements from the General Assembly are saying, hey, you as a seminary, you need to worry less about some of the more mechanical skills of being a pastor. So the General Assembly is going to make a recommendation that they drop the languages. You don't need to learn Hebrew. You don't need to learn Greek. Now, a professor at Princeton Seminary, I forget what he said, but one of the quotes was, one of the best preparations for heaven is Greek grammar, right? And essentially, he was trying to emphasize that when you are training as a minister, things like Greek grammar are valid and important for your sanctification. Now, I'm not saying, and I don't believe he's saying that if you don't know Greek, you're not going to heaven. But it's the emphasis that these things are of value. And now they're saying, let's drop it. Let's focus on more practical things. Let's help people get through their lives. Let's inspire people a little bit as they're moving through their lives. Under Warfield, they celebrate their 100th year as a university or as a seminary. At that point, they had trained over 6,000 students. And during this time, there became president of the seminary a man named Joseph Ross Stevenson. We'll talk about Joseph Ross Stevenson. We got to hurry up. Maybe we'll have to finish the rest of this next week or the week after. Joseph Ross Stevenson becomes the second president of the seminary. So in the past, there wasn't a president of the seminary. It was just run by the board of directors. And there was a man before him, was it Moffat? Patton. There was a man named Dr. Patton who was the president of the seminary. He was kind of aloof. He wasn't really good at raising money, but he was a sweet boy. We like that. We like that about him. He was a great guy, great professor, but he was terrible at admin, right? So a man becomes in charge, J. Ross Stevenson. At that time, soon, Warfield dies, has a heart attack, dies a couple days later in 1929. Casper Wister Hodge Jr. takes over. We won't talk about him much. At the same time, J. Ross Stevenson becomes president of the university. Now, this is during the 1920s. Secular ideas begin to dominate the universities. Doctrinal issues are avoided. Heresy prosecutions disappear. Theological liberals gain leadership in the church. There's a plan called the Philadelphia Plan that hopes to unite 19 church denominations, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, all that. And they basically say, let's stop with all the theological fussing. Let's just be friends. And this begins the movement of unity over theology. J. Ross Stevens is the reason for the downfall of Old Princeton. I will put it on him. He rejects this sentiment that we need to fight for good theology. He completely disembarks from the Archibald Alexander mindset of let's seek Christ and the confession. His mindset is like, let's just go along to get along. Like, we don't need to fight anymore. We don't need to be doing all this. And so there's two huge issues that go on during this time that caused the downfall of Old Princeton. The Machen issue. J. Gresham Machen, I used him, damned if you do, damned if you don't, as a picture the first week that we were here together. Machen is a preeminent scholar, absolutely, such a keen intellect, smart, intelligent man. He is a New Testament professor at the university, assistant of New Testament theology. He never becomes more than an assistant professor. And essentially, they keep holding him back on purpose. So they offer him the Systematic Theology Chair. Once Warfield dies, he says that might be too much. He's like, I don't know if I could fill those shoes. So he continues to teach New Testament theology. In 1926, the board of directors votes him to be the chair of apologetics. And now in the past, whatever the board of directors basically suggested to the General Assembly would be like, hey, we trust you guys do it. But at this time, the General Assembly is holding trial after trial against Princeton, saying we don't have confidence in you guys. We think you're losing it. You guys are focusing on all the wrong things. Eventually, there's a statement by the General Assembly that says that as a minister, you don't need to promote inspiration, resurrection, atonement, incarnation, and one more thing. So basically, as a minister of the gospel, you don't need to say that the Bible is inspired. You don't need to say that Jesus resurrected. You don't need to say that Jesus was incarnate. You don't need to believe that he died for your sins. And finally, you don't need to believe in an eschaton. You don't need to believe in a true eternal kingdom. That's the state, right? So liberalism is now in full effect. So Machen writes in 1924, it was the 100th anniversary this year, he wrote a book called Christianity and Liberalism. And he essentially says Christianity and liberalism are two different religions. They exist in different theological spaces. They are not the same religion. As much as liberals want to say that, and this caused a fire. People hated this. And so when he's voted in 1926 to become the chair of apologetics at the university, the General Assembly says no. And they have a trial, and they interview hundreds of people trying to basically, it's a witch hunt to try to get Machen out. They think he's too mad, they think he's too crass, they think he's evil. And all the students and all the faculty look at the General Assembly and say, this dude's great. We love this guy. Like, you should really pick this guy. At the same time, there's an issue with the board. Essentially what they want to do, I didn't really talk about this, but in 1822, they created the Board of Trustees. So there existed a board of directors, and they created a board of trustees. The board of directors was in charge of the faculty, the curriculum, making sure the theological compass was pointing north. The board of trustees was in charge of the campus and raising money. So there were two different, it was the business side, kind of the spiritual side. Well, in 1927 through 29, there's this big debate of saying we should collapse these two and make it one board who has all the power. And the professors fought against this, tooth and nail, right? There's two factions, but they fought against this, saying like, no, we see the writing on the wall. The Board of Trustees will come in together as businessmen, and they will make decisions. They will crush the curriculum. They will change everything. And finally, in 1929, that's ratified. And again, that's all because of J. Ross Stevenson. He was a part of it. He very much supported this. This was, I spoke about Christianity, liberalism. Stevenson praised the book, but he maintained that conservatives should not stir up any trouble by attempting to remove liberals from the church. Craziness, right? Like if Zach got up today and said, hey, there's a contingent of liberals that are sitting on the board now. I won't name names, but there is a contingent of liberals on the board. And you know what? I know what you're thinking. We should kick them off. We're not going to do that. We're just going to keep them on the team. Let's just be at peace. Christian unity. Again, Christian unity is the highest goal. And he says, no, don't do that. Just be at peace with these people. And so he essentially digs the grave for Old Princeton Seminary. Machen leaves in 1929. He starts Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and Westminster Theological Seminary essentially holds the mantle, takes the mantle of what Old Princeton was to be the Reformed Presbyterian theological institution that remains orthodox, that remains true to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So that's it. From beginning to end, I certainly missed some of my key points that I wanted to make, but here is, and I'm going to end on this. I know I'm 5 minutes over. Liberalism takes us left. Liberalism, we swing left, institutions move that way, and so it is crucial for us to remain where the Bible is, even if the polls are swinging and we're seeming like radicals, we're seeming like crazy people. We cannot move away from the Bible. We're going to learn furthermore about how these men lived their lives, what theology they taught, and we're going to end this class on what does it look like to guard an institution. Final class will be about J. Gresham Machen. Hopefully I can continue to share this good news with you all. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate you guys. Sorry for taking time.